Hello, good afternoon. My name is Benny Liu, and I teach at the Religious Studies Department at Holy Cross. I'm so glad that you're here today, this afternoon, to hear what is sure to be a fascinating lecture by Professor Mary Jane Rubenstein. This lecture is funded by the college's McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. So I want to thank the center's director, Dr. Tom Landy, for his support. Professor Rubenstein is the Dean of the Social Sciences as well as Professor of Religion and Science in Society at Wesleyan University. In addition to these two official titles, she is also affiliated with Wesleyan University's Philosophy Department and the Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies program. An excellent teacher, she has won an award for excellence in teaching at Wesleyan. She is also the author of, so far, 4 books. First one, Strange Wonder, The Closure of Metaphysics and the Opening of All. Second one, World Without End, The Many Lives of the Multiverse. Third, Pantheologies, Gods, Worlds, and Monsters. And most recently, Astrotopia, The Dangerous Religion of Corporate Space Race. In addition, she has also co-authored Image, 3 Inquiries in Technology and Imagination, and co-edited Entangled Worlds, Religion, Science, and New Materialisms. I don't know how she does it, but she basically has a book out every 2 or 3 years. Please help me welcome this prolific writer, award-winning teacher, and one of the most creative thinker of things, Professor Mary Jane Rubenstein.
Benny Liu, thank you so much for this beautiful invitation, for that lovely, lovely and undeserved introduction. I'm so honored to be here. Thanks to Ruby Francis also for organizing the details of my visit today. I was just saying to some of our colleagues when I got here, I realized that my cousin went here, my big cousin, the cousin I grew up with, like the important cousin, the cousin I was like, oh, she does all amazing things, and then she went to Holy Cross. So for me, Holy Cross is like the place you go to college. It's like that's where you go. And I remember turning like 12 or 13 and being told there were other colleges, and I was like, that can't be. Holy Cross is the place you go to college. There can't be other places. So it's a real joy to be here. I've never actually been up this sort of sacred mountain, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for your presence here this afternoon. Let's do it. Let's get into this. I'm going to take you back in time a little bit. It feels like forever ago. I'm going to take you back to October 23rd, 2020, which was one day after the last Biden-Trump debate, and 7 months into an epidemiological nightmare that had closed schools, crippled local businesses, and killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. So you remember like COVID when it was brand new and really scary and nobody knew what was happening? Right at that moment, the GOP tweeted a final distillation of its campaign platform. Here it is. Pres Trump is fighting for you. Here are some of his priorities for a second term. Now you picture yourself. You are like, you've been stuck in your house for 7 months. You have no idea what's happening. First, establish permanent manned presence on the moon. Second, send the first manned mission to Mars. And we're all like, oh my God, I haven't left my house in 6 months. Like, what are you? After the moon and Mars came infrastructure and Wi-Fi, and then in a follow-up tweet, the GOP promised a COVID vaccine, medical supplies, and pharmaceuticals, but they clearly wanted the extraterrestrial stuff out front. Who wants to worry about respirators when you could dream about rockets? You might recall that during his first 100 days in office, President Biden signed 60 executive orders, almost half of which were direct reversals of Trump-era policies. This administration disagrees with that one on nearly everything except outer space. In fact, the only major Trump-era objectives that the Biden administration has retained are, first, the creation of a space force to wage orbital warfare, and second, the plan to settle the moon and Mars through a new mission they're calling Artemis, after the Greek goddess of the moon, the twin sister of Apollo. Why do we need to settle the moon and Mars? In Biden's perplexing words, because America can do big things. We can see possibilities no one has seen before. We can go places no one has gone before. Seriously, what does this mean? Why are we going to space? The message was much clearer in the Trump administration, which insisted it is America's duty to spread its influence throughout the universe. As Trump declared in his last State of the Union address, in reaffirming our heritage as a free nation, we must remember that America has always been a frontier nation. Now we must embrace the next frontier, America's manifest destiny in the stars. Manifest destiny, a 19th century coinage, was the idea that God was calling European-descended Americans to expand across the whole North American continent, right? So not just the East Coast, but like all the way out. So when Trump reminds the US, the space-bound US, that it is a frontier nation, he's extending this notion of manifest destiny cosmically. The God who called 19th century America to conquer the last frontier of California is now calling 21st century America to conquer the infinite frontier of outer space. Now, as we all know, Donald Trump didn't invent the idea of space as the final frontier, but neither did Star Trek. Rather, the metaphor originates with the former Nazi rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. The year's 1952, which is to say 7 years after the end of World War II. Most of Germany's leading physicists have been granted amnesty in the US through the CIA's then secret Operation Paperclip. And in March, Collier's magazine publishes a special issue called Man Will Conquer Space Soon. The lead article, written by the man who designed the V-2 rockets that incinerated London and Antwerp, was called Crossing the Last Frontier. So here's where that connection between outer space, the frontier, and manifest destiny takes root. In the short years following his amnesty in the US, von Braun had become convinced it was America's duty to extend human civilization into outer space for the sake of freedom, for the sake of democracy, and get this, for the sake of eternal salvation. A little-known detail about von Braun, whose German rockets were built by Jews in concentration camps, is that during his denazification on American soil, he became a born-again Christian who believed it was incumbent upon American earthlings to spread the gospel to what he called man's oldest and last frontier, the heavens themselves. Okay. So in February of 2020, then President Trump says, we're going back to the moon and then to Mars because space is the next frontier and America's manifest destiny is in the stars. Unsurprisingly, the left-wing press gets offended at this intrusion of colonial God language into the secular, science-y space program. But as we've just seen with von Braun, the language of divinely authorized conquest in space is nothing new. The only thing that's unprecedented in the contemporary space race is the extent to which private industry is involved. By the time Trump revealed his plans for NASA's next big directive, Elon Musk's SpaceX was already ferrying people and materials to the International Space Station. Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin was battling SpaceX for government contracts on a lunar lander, and Musk was preparing his burgeoning fan base to leave this doomed planet and colonize Mars. Meanwhile, space mining firms were preparing to start extracting and selling water, ore, and precious metals from asteroids and the moon, and space tourism companies were promising orbital joyrides and overnight stays in a hypothetical space hotel named after, guess who, Wernher von Braun. I'm not going to stay in a space hotel named after Wernher von Braun, like, just in case anybody's wondering. Be like, no, you're not. This is the era known as NewSpace, and it adds the speed and intensity of unregulated capitalist economics to an already dense field of political, military, technological, and religious reasons to get America back to space as soon as possible. Let's start with politics. In the spring of 2019, Vice President Mike Pence told the newly reconstituted National Space Council, "I'm here on the President's behalf to tell the American people that it is the stated policy of this administration and the United States of America to return American astronauts to the moon within the next 5 years. So," he said, "NASA's rockets were going to have to be updated, and fast. But know this," warned Pence, "the President has directed NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine to accomplish this goal by any means necessary." The Washington Post had a great time poking fun at this tonal urgency. Hadn't we already been to the moon, the editors asked, in a cheeky editorial called Mike Pence boldly sending America back to where man has gone before. Doing the same thing all over again, by any means necessary. Operating under this unexplained, intense urgency, Pence spends a good deal of this speech threatening NASA. Step up, he orders. And if you don't, we will find somebody else who will, like Musk or Bezos or Branson. Because regardless of the means, says Pence, we are going to the moon again. As he reaches his conclusion, Pence shifts from commander to preacher. Let's go with confidence, Pence says, nodding his head. And let's go with faith. Faith that Americans can achieve anything we put our minds to, and especially faith in the courage of American astronauts, that next generation of restless pioneers that will carry American leadership into space. And lastly, he says, let's have that other kind of faith as well. Let's have that faith as America renews our commitment to leadership in space, as we call on our best and brightest minds to achieve those goals, and we send our most courageous to suit up and go. But those we send, let's have faith that they will not go alone. For as millions of Americans have cherished throughout our long and storied history of exploration by this nation, let's believe, as the old book says, and here his eyes narrow, this is the important part, that there's nowhere we can go from his spirit. If we rise on the wings of the dawn, if we settle on the far side of the sea, even if we go up to the heavens, there his hand will guide us, and his right hand will hold us fast. First, I would just like to confirm your suspicion that there is no such thing as the old book. It's just not a thing anyone says. There is the good book, and there is what Christians call the Old Testament, but I can't tell whether Pence is just accidentally mixing up these terms or whether he's trying to coin a new one. At any rate, Pence's lofty language here is an adaptation of the Old Testament, more appropriately called the Hebrew Bible, whose Psalm 139 asks, "Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle on the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me fast." Again, biblical justifications for American pioneerism are nothing new. The 19th century gave us manifest destiny, but it was drawing on a theme that stretches back to the 16th century, when the first English settlers thought of themselves as God's new Israel. Just like Abraham, Moses, and Joshua, the pilgrims believed they were called to settle a new promised land, a new Canaan across the seas. As it turns out, there are 20 towns in the United States bearing this name, including Canaan, Connecticut, about 2 hours west of us, and New Canaan, Connecticut, about 2 hours south of us. What's ingenious about Pence's invocation of Psalm 139 is that it extends God's donation of land from Canaan to New England to Florida and California, and then all the way to infinity. Even if we go up to the heavens, Pence reminds us, God goes with us. So wherever we go in the universe, that's our promised land. In outer space, America has found an infinite Canaan, and that's the name of our show. So what I'm trying to do this afternoon is to put the NewSpace race in colonial context, to see this private-public partnership as an extension of the political and economic and religious infrastructure that justified the white European seizure of the Americas, the white American seizure of the continent, and the capitalist seizure of the globe. Let me be clear and say that my hope in this examination is not to invalidate space exploration. It's simply to ask that we find a better way to do it than to go cosmic with the old Christian colonial playbook. Second caveat, when I use the words Christian colonial, I am not referring to the Christianity of Martin Luther King, of Dorothy Day, Daniel and Philip Berrigan, or any of the other anti-racist, anti-war, earth-loving, creature-nurturing communities and teachers out there, many of whom are near and dear to a lot of us. Rather, I'm talking about the imperial Christianity, or what the 19th century called Christendom, that teamed up with early capitalism, European expansion, and a particularly racist form of science to colonize the earth. I'm talking about the violent ransacking and possessing that all but the rightist wing of Christians now decry as stemming from a terrible interpretation of Scripture, motivated by greed. These Christians include the leaders of the Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican communions, who recently issued a joint statement telling the people of the earth to get it together and stop plundering the planet. I'm paraphrasing, it's more or less what they were saying, like, get it together. When I call out the imperial Christian inheritance of space exploration then, I am thinking in line with these Christian thinkers, along with Jewish ecologists, atheist forest defenders, indigenous water protectors, and Afrofuturist utopians like Sun Ra, who sang from a racist, ecocidal planet that space was the place of what he called another kind of living life. With them, I wonder if there is a just, peaceful, and equitable way to explore planetary bodies beyond Earth. Is there a just, peaceful, and equitable way to live on them? How might we make outer space habitable, not just for wealthy white escape artists like Branson and Bezos and Musk, but for a whole thriving ecosystem? And is there any way to make the Earth more habitable in the process? I am not sure, but my sense is that we've got to unearth the destructive stories to break through to the creative ones. So into the colonial mess we go. The story of the European conquest of the Americas usually starts in the late 15th century, with Pope Alexander VI having given the New World to Ferdinand and Isabella, king and queen of the newly unified, newly de-Muslimed and de-Jewed Spain. Why Spain? Because of their recent victory against the Saracens, which is to say the Muslims, who had previously ruled the Iberian Peninsula. If these monarchs could win their own land for Christ, the Pope reasoned, they had a decent chance of winning him a new one. Why did the Pope think these lands were his to give? That's another question. Out of the fullness of our apostolic power, Alexander declared, by the authority of Almighty God conferred upon us in blessed Peter and of the vicarship of Jesus Christ, which we hold on earth. Let's break this down. I mean, I know you know this, the way that this works, but just in case you don't, this is the way that goes. Here's the Pope, right? He gets his authority from the bishops of Rome before him, who get theirs from the Apostle Peter, who gets his when Jesus puts him in charge in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus gets his authority from God Almighty, right, in the words of this text, whom Jesus, of course, incarnates in the Catholic tradition. So in giving the New World to Spain, Alexander VI is the direct channel of God, who, to fill in the biblical backstory, has always been a consummate land giver, a giver of land. Let's look quickly at Genesis 1. Right after the creation of human beings, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." So God makes the earth for humans, gives them the land, right? Notice again, land giving is like right there, and tells them to imitate him in relation to that land. Go, make worlds, make habitats, make people. In other words, act like me. And just like me, have dominion over everything else. Have the land, make a world. With the giving of the covenant, all this land acquisition and world making gets far more specific. So we find in Genesis 15, then God said to Abram, "I'm the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, 'To your descendants, I give this land.'" Right? We're looking at land donation moments in the Bible. I give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. This is the first of 2 times that God makes a covenant with Abram, soon to be renamed Abraham. And notice that the first reward for following the covenant is land. 2 chapters later, the reward is going to be children, through whom God gives his blessing throughout Abraham's generations forever. So the first covenant scene gives land, and the second gives descendants, which is to say the first gives space, and the second gives time. Back to the first covenant scene. "Do what I say," says God, "and I will give your descendants this land." Land, incidentally, that belongs to a whole lot of other people. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites. What are the Israelites supposed to do with them when they get to the promised land? "You must utterly destroy them," Deuteronomy tells us. "Make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, for they would turn away your children from following me to serve other gods. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, hew down their sacred poles, and burn their idols with fire." Great. As you may know, God's promise to Abraham is fulfilled really slowly over the course of generations, with huge detours like the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt, their wandering for 40 years in the desert, and the death of Moses, after which Joshua finally leads the people into the promised land and initiates the so-called conquest of Canaan to rid the land of its native inhabitants. Now, it is important to point out here that the conquest of Canaan doesn't actually seem to have happened. These parts of Deuteronomy and Joshua are basically the revenge fantasy of a displaced and exiled people trying to assure themselves in Babylon that God is on their side when it seems like he's not. But in the hands of Christian imperialists, this exilic text creates what Osage scholar Robert Warrior calls a narrative problem, namely divine justification for the destruction of indigenous people and their lands. And indeed, just as they were calling the Americas a new Israel, the early European settlers called Native Americans new Canaanites, destined to be displaced, eliminated, and forgotten. And such settlers were drawing not just from the covenant between God and Abraham, but also from the so-called new covenant between Christ and the church. Within the logic of this new covenant, God's land donation goes global, most notably in the text known as the Great Commission, and Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." It is this injunction to make disciples of all nations that Alexander VI, now we're back, is presumably heeding when he gives Spain the New World for the purpose of converting its indigenous inhabitants to Christianity. At least the Great Commission provides an excellent cover for what seems to be Alexander's real purpose, which is to say the stuff that the land conceals, like the spices and the gold and the metals and things like that. More on this in a minute. So the conquistadors are headed west to claim whatever they find for Spain and the church. And what do they do when they get there? They perform a two-part religious ceremony, retelling their creation myth and ritually installing a vertical thing in the ground, usually a cross or a flag, to claim and secure the new land. Now, we've all seen images of the ritual planting of these vertical structures, right? But what do I mean when I say that the Europeans retold their creation myth? I wish it were more interesting, but it is a little bizarre. I mean that the conquistadors hit land in the Americas, and then from the boat, like from the bow of the ship or from the shore, they had some sailor read out loud in Latin a text, like called the Requisition, that declares first, God created the heavens and the earth. Now just imagine this. Imagine you are an indigenous American sitting on the shores of the eastern seaboard. You see this big ship, the likes of which you have never seen before. It comes across and you're like, what's happening? What's going on? And some dude stands on the bow of the ship with like a scroll, holds it up, and is like, God created the heavens and the earth. Except he's saying it in Latin, which you don't understand, and in fact, which he probably doesn't understand either. It's a very strange scene. It's a really weird thing to do. But these are the things that the Requisition says, that the soldier, the sailor, is just saying. First, people of the Americas, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, so you see this is a creation myth. They are retelling their creation myth. Second, God created one man and one woman, Adam and Eve. Third, all human beings, including you, are children of this God and of these first parents. Fourth, God put St. Peter in charge of all human beings. 5, St. Peter's seat is now occupied by another guy named Alexander VI. 6, Alexander VI says this land is Spain's land. 7, you can either accept this truth or not. 8, if you do, we will be your friends, and we will occupy your land, and we will trade fairly with you. If you don't, we will destroy you and enslave your children and do all manner of evil against you, the text says. Okay, so check out what's happening here. The Requisition, right, this sort of justification for the taking of indigenous land, is proclaiming in Latin, which literally nobody understands, all humanity to be one for the purpose of installing the Christian God as the universal God, and the Pope as the universal Pope, and Spain as the universal sovereign in a chain of rulers above them. As Sylvia Wynter shows throughout her magnificent body of work, this universal humanism, right, we're all the same, we're all one people, we're all children of the same God, effectively uses Christian theology to authorize European supremacy. In other words, the Spaniards told the Native Americans that they were all brothers and sisters, all part of one big human family, in order to justify the seizure of their lands. So as I'm going to suggest, when we get back to our billionaire space barons, the problem with universal humanism, right, I am acting on behalf of all humanity, all the future of humankind, is that the people who announce this universal humanism also set the rules of the game, declaring themselves agents of God or destiny or the future of humanity and the entire biosphere. A little more history first. The 16th century land grab was justified by a political idea called the doctrine of discovery. It parceled out the Americas to Europe and then reappeared after a few centuries as manifest destiny. Manifest destiny found its fullest legal articulation in the 1862 Homestead Act, which gave any 21-year-old citizen who'd never borne arms against the United States a large plot of Western land for $1.25 an acre. Of course, the US government could only sell this land to white settlers by taking it from Native Americans, whom it forcibly relocated to reservations so that non-Native Americans could fulfill their God-given destiny. In 1890, the US Census Bureau declared the frontier closed. And although the Homestead Act wouldn't be repealed until 1976, there was already a sense at the turn of the 20th century that there was nowhere left for restless white folks to go. Nothing left to conquer. How were Americans supposed to have a future without a frontier? When Wernher von Braun and his aeronautical colleagues declared the opening of the last frontier then, they were appealing to a distinctly white American nostalgia for the future, a longing for yesterday's tomorrow, for the seemingly infinite horizon of the 1870s, now imagined from the tidy tract houses of 1950s America, and popularized by none other than, wait for it, Walt Disney. The story is a dense one. You're like, Disney, what does he do? I will distill this into a few key moments. The year was 1954. Disney had almost finished the plans for his embryonic theme park in Anaheim, California. 3 of his 4 anchoring lands, you can see there's Fantasyland, there's Frontierland, Adventureland, and Tomorrowland, right? 3 of those 4 were completely planned. Fantasyland would revolve around Sleeping Beauty's castle. Adventureland would replicate the exotic continents of Africa and Asia. And Frontierland would put the visitor in a Davy Crockett cap, leading him through a wilderness covered by wagons and pack mules and a mine train. But for all of that, Disney could not figure out what to do with Tomorrowland. What would the future look like? What could it look like? Disney was apparently stuck, until one of his animators suggested he take a look at that Collier's issue from 1952. At which point, Disney told his associates, round up every one of these contributors. Tomorrowland is going to introduce Disney pilgrims to outer space. To be sure, this Collier's issue gave a jolt not only to Walt Disney, but to the political machine as well, insisting, as the editors did, that the US must immediately embark on a long-range development program to secure for the West space superiority. If we do not, somebody else will. That somebody else very probably would be the Soviet Union. This eventually became the argument Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson used after the launch of Sputnik to urge the creation of NASA, and the argument that presidential candidate Kennedy used to insist that America had to be the first to reach the moon. But out in Anaheim, California, the space race was doing more Imagineering work, building the infrastructure of popular America's God-given future in space by modeling it Disney style. Above all, this sacred infrastructure was going to need a rocket as a vertical anchor, the space-age equivalent of a steeple or a minaret or a flagpole. And who better to design this rocket than the newly minted cosmic evangelist Wernher von Braun? To be sure, his designs needed some aesthetic work, but the ever malleable von Braun was happy to take Disney's notes and reshape his reportedly very ugly rockets into a more streamlined, Jetsons-like prototype. Once the new design was in place, von Braun served as professor expert in 2 major Disney films detailing the impending human conquest of space, which somewhere around 50% of Americans ended up watching, riveted, dreaming of what life would be on Jupiter and Mars. When he finally broke ground, Disney positioned his von Braun-inspired Tomorrowland directly opposite Frontierland, architecturally affirming America's aeronautic future as the ideological inheritance of its infinite frontier past. Like, right, this is where we've been, and this is where we're headed. But the real topography was vertical. What von Braun and Disney and Johnson and Kennedy were imagining was an upward and infinite extension of the European-style colonialism that had brought them to California. Just as the Europeans had brought Christian civilization across the seas and manifest destiny had extended across the continent, von Braun's redeemed Nazi rockets would bring it out to other worlds, remaking them in the image of Earth. Just over a decade after the establishment of Disney World, NASA's Apollo missions orbited and landed on the poor, overdetermined moon, their Saturn rockets based on von Braun's Disney-tweaked designs. I'm going to say this again. The Apollo rockets were based on Disney's reimagined version of Wernher von Braun's V2 rockets. Okay. And what did they do when they got there? Well, the crew of Apollo did the old religious colonial two-step of reciting their creation myth and installing a vertical structure in the ground. What am I talking about? On Christmas Eve, 1968, 1 billion Earthlings tuned in to see live footage of the Apollo 8 mission. The orbit was exquisitely timed, and as NASA's public affairs officer figured, the night before Christmas would find most Americans at home with their families so they could all watch TV. Knowing that more people would be watching this broadcast than any other event in history, the crew showed the visitors around a little bit. They said, like, here's this crater, and here are some cracks over here, and there's the Sea of Tranquility. But, like, honestly, all anybody could see was a gray quasi-trapezoid that could just as well have been somebody's kitchen counter as the surface of the moon. You just sort of trust them that that's the moon. Suddenly, without any change in the image, the mood of the broadcast becomes measured and formal as astronaut Bill Anders announces the lunar sunrise. Presumably, he and his colleagues have just seen the coming of the light. Recording goes like, and for all the people back on Earth, says Anders, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. What's the message? What are the spacemen going to say? What are they going to say? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Anders, Frank Borman, and Jim Lovell take turns reading the whole first book of Genesis. The story about the 6-day creation, the goodness of every part of it, and the making of humans in the image of God from their spaceship orbiting the moon. No matter how many times I think it through, this mythic retelling makes me pause. Why did the crew of Apollo 8 read Genesis? Why did they read anything at all? The most straightforward but least satisfying answer is that NASA's public affairs officer prepared the astronauts for the mission, and he said, "You got to say something appropriate," since it was such a momentous occasion. After asking a bunch of colleagues and friends and their spouses what to say, the crew decided on Genesis. Okay, but what was it that made them say that Genesis was the appropriate text for this occasion? Why not the national anthem, or God Bless America, or Moon River, or Blue Moon? Why Genesis? Here, I tend to visualize Apollo 8 in a split screen next to the Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, the first human to travel to space. Gagarin is said to have exclaimed on his 1961 journey in low Earth orbit, "I see no God up here," he says. Whether or not he actually said this, the Russian press popularized the story of Gagarin's anti-revelation, gleefully enumerating all of the saints and angels he had not seen in his trip around their dwelling place, right? He didn't see the angel Gabriel, he didn't see St. Peter, he didn't see the Virgin Mary, he didn't see any of them. Again, regardless of, and this is a Soviet propaganda poster that says, "God and yet, no God," right? And this is Gagarin being like, I don't see anything. Regardless of whether or not he said anything like this, the message was that the Soviets had won the race to space because of their rugged atheism. As one journal explained, the reason the West lagged so far behind was that Europe and America were stuck in dark superstitions while the USSR was off storming the heavens. Religion was holding the Western world back from the revelations of modern science. In this light, the Apollo 8 reading of Genesis was appropriate because it announced America's Judeo-Christian victory over its Soviet atheist rivals. If the Russians couldn't see God up in the heavens, then the Americans would just bring him on up there. But again, why God? Why not Adam Smith or Alexander Hamilton or Henry Ford? Surely atheism was not the only feature of communism that the Americans found objectionable. Why target the religious difference between the US and the USSR rather than the political or economic difference? At this point, it's important to remember that in the Americas in particular, religious behavior and religious claims have traditionally underwritten political and economic pursuits. Just like the Requisition, Manifest Destiny, and any State of the Union address that asks God to continue to bless these United States, Apollo 8's reading of Genesis at the climax of the Apollo 8 mission laid claim to a divine mandate by reminding the world that their God had created the heavens and the earth and put their sorts of humans in charge. The crew of Apollo 8 was asserting America's God-given dominion over creation itself. This space, they were saying, is our space. What clearer confirmation could there be than Apollo 11 with its ceremonial planting of the American flag? Directed to do so by Congress, but knowing there was no air on the moon, engineers at the Johnson Space Center in Houston wove a metal rod into the fabric of the flag to ensure the whole Earth could see the stars and stripes extended from the pole. Right? What they were worried about was that you get the pole up there and the flag would just be like, but it has to get, but there was no wind, there's no air. So they put this rod this way. The problem is that they used the wrong heat-resistant coating for this pole, so that when Armstrong and Aldrin went to extend the rod along the red and white stripes, it was bent. But then they thought, like, oh, well, this is even better. It looks like the flag is waving in the wind because it's kind of a little bit wonky because of that bend. Meanwhile, Michael Collins circled the moon in a command module named after Christopher Columbus. So these two are down there. Michael Collins is going like this, and again, the command module is named after Christopher Columbus. So the message is clear. The same divine imperative that had brought Europeans across the seas was now bringing Americans up to the stars. And the same myths and rituals that laid claim to the Americas were now laying claim to the moon. Okay, technically they weren't claiming the moon. In January of '67, the UN General Assembly had passed the Outer Space Treaty, which reserves outer space exclusively for peaceful purposes, and which declares toward that end that outer space can't be appropriated by national bodies. So legally speaking, Armstrong and Aldrin weren't claiming the moon, they couldn't. But ritually, symbolically, the moon has belonged to the US since 1969. When the two of them kicked around some space dust and prayed that the stars and stripes they had rigged with wire hangers would stay up long enough for a photo shoot. I mean, like the minute they walked away, the flag went like that. There's nothing to stick a flag into on the moon. It's total, like, it's it's very, very hard. And there's like some lunar dust on top of it, but you can't like plant it. So they were like they're trying to kind of make sure that the thing stayed up. You know, you get the photo and then they walk away and the thing fell over. But you need the photo. It's the image, right? That's important. It's the image of American dominance. Fast forward to February 1st, 2010, when the Obama administration released the 2011 budget for NASA that ended the space shuttle program and reallocated funds to the so-called NewSpace industries. It is time, Obama's advisors had written, to consider turning this transport service over to the commercial sector. You know, to make rocket ships as mass-produced as cars and buses and speedboats and airplanes. The problem, of course, was funding. Who would invest in a company dedicated to flying supplies up to the space station? What would be in it for the stakeholders? The situation for the cosmic prospector seemed grim until November 2015, when Congress passed a startlingly bipartisan bill called the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, which promises, among other things, that any US citizen who recovers a rock or a mineral or a bit of water in the space is allowed to own it, use it, and sell it. Hooray, said the investors. We're saved, said the space mining firms. After all, if a corporation is a person, a citizen even, which it is under US law, then its extractions and uses and sales will be protected under this law. That's what's in it for us, said the space mining firms. We can take stuff and sell it. Elated, the CEO of Moon Express, a lunar mining outfit that collaborates closely with NASA, went so far as to call the CSLCA the aeronautic equivalent of the Homestead Act. It's like, this is what's going to give out parcels of land to Americans now. But wait a minute, I hear you cry. Didn't the Outer Space Treaty say no one can own a celestial body? Sure, American law speaks back to you, but it didn't say you can't own the stuff in a celestial body. So the 2015 Act concludes by saying it is our understanding that we're not violating the Outer Space Treaty. And in the fall of 2020, the NASA-initiated Artemis Accords, like Leah formed, that the extraction of space resources does not inherently violate the Outer Space Treaty, especially not when the extractor in question is a transnational corporation to which the signatories agree these restrictions can't really apply anyway. Meanwhile, Elon Musk is promising to build a Starship every 72 hours at his South Texas plant. Starship is that mammoth rocket that exploded last April, doing untold damage to land and waterways and turtles and birds, not to mention cars and houses and human lungs. Musk is aiming to bring 1 million people to Mars by the end of this decade. So as he puts it, I think we need probably on the order of 1,000 ships. And while international law twiddles its thumbs, Musk declares it doesn't affect him anyway. In the super small print of SpaceX's Starlink contract, right? If you buy Starlink internet access, anybody who signs up for broadband service agrees to recognize Mars as a free planet and affirm that no Earth-based government has any authority or sovereignty over Martian activities. So Musk has already declared independence for a planet he has never visited. Weird, illegal, but no weirder or less legal than a pope declaring the subjugation of a hemisphere he's never visited. Meanwhile, our beautiful Earth swims in an increasingly dense sea of techno-detritus. The European Space Agency estimates there are about 34,000 large objects, 900,000 medium objects, and 128 million small objects currently circling the planet because none of our bleeding-edge aeronautic projects undertaken by a slew of actual geniuses can figure out how to clean up after themselves. I'm serious. Nobody has yet figured out how to pick up a single piece of space garbage. The idea of space as an empty frontier is allowing us to take our worst earthly tendencies to the stars. So in the fall of 2020, I was teaching a seminar called Colonizing Space to 18 brilliant, scared, exhausted students on Zoom. Oh, that looked like the worst idea in the world. We were reading most of the stuff that I've been talking about here: the history of colonialism, the biblical legacy, imperial theology, astronautic policy, extractivism, space law, and also indigenous philosophies and Afrofuturist writings, which I was hoping would give us ideas about alternatives to capitalist plunder. I had patched the syllabus together in a mood of total loneliness, wondering if these connections would matter or even make sense to anybody else. The students saw it immediately: the secular messiahs, the hypocritical humanisms, the effort to save the world with the same operations that have wrecked it. But no one was really saying much about it until October of 2020, with the publication of a NASA white paper written by a team of justice-minded astronomers and astrobiologists. In this admittedly dense report, NASA communications specialist Frank Tavares and a host of co-authors argue that the capitalist colonial approach to space is profoundly misguided and even dangerous. They remind the government agencies that the commodification of celestial bodies will pollute the environment of the solar system, create disastrous working conditions in space, and exacerbate inequalities on Earth. They warn them that unchecked resource extraction might change the moon and Mars forever, causing aesthetic offense to some humans and religious offense to others. They expose the chauvinism of astro-utopias, whose imagined communities are limited to wealthy, young, able-bodied, hetero-reproductive, and overwhelmingly white bodies. They decry the lack of regulation of private space actors, whom the spacefaring governments frankly seem to fear, right? If you raise a complaint to the FAA about Elon Musk, they're like, we can't. And these authors call the Outer Space Treaty non-binded, outdated, and inadequate. With all these problems in mind, the authors make one single modest recommendation. They ask that NASA collect community input regarding their current priorities in space. In other words, the agency should tell us what they're up to with their lunar outposts and their lunar mines and their asteroid mines and their Martian aspirations, and ask us what we think. Input, the authors suggest. Not just output, not just infomercials and charming animations, but input, the thoughts of us non-specialists, who after all have our own kind of wisdom. We may not be rocket scientists, but we know about the systems the rocket scientists are relying on. We know what the energy system has done to our water, what the aeronautics industry has done to our skies, what the space industry is doing to our mountains. We know that transnational corporations don't value the health of their workers, and that a thriving titanium economy does nothing to give poor folks a living wage. We know that the only likely thing to trickle down from space is going to be more pollution. At the same time, we also know there are other ways to go about things. Some of us can navigate by the stars. Others can restore the balance of ecosystems. Others can study and even work the land without destroying it. We know the values we try to teach our kids, like sharing and gentleness, listening, only taking what you need, and cleaning up after yourself. Are the space agencies ready to hear this sort of input? Are they ready to hear that for some of us, our ancestors live in the spaceways? For others, the planets are gods, and for others, mountains are sacred and therefore not to be mined? And is NASA ready to adjust their practices and plans accordingly? Here, Tavares and his colleagues suggest that traditional ecological knowledge might teach the space industry other ways to live in relation to cosmic land and other ways to do science. Ways that prioritize, here I'm moving up from the bottom of the slide, respect, intentionality, relation, sustainability, multi-generational wisdom, and interdisciplinarity. Perhaps most counterintuitively for Western institutions like NASA, traditional ecological knowledge learns not just about the world, but from the world. Plants know how to make food from the sun. Mushrooms know how to send messages between trees. Geese know how to fly from Canada to North Carolina without a GPS, and my 6-pound cat once managed to keep himself alive outside for 3 weeks without a human-made shelter or factory farm food. For these reasons, as Potawatomi biologist Robin Wall Kimmerer explains, in native ways of knowing, human people are often referred to as the younger brothers of creation. We say that humans have the least experience with how to live and thus the most to learn. We must look to our teachers among the other species for guidance. Such other species can teach us how to live in relation to land without destroying it or even owning it. And crucially, this sort of learning would not amount to a refusal of technology, but to a redefinition of it. In the words of Dene futurist Luke Hornum, advanced technologies are not finely tuned mechanisms of endless destruction. Advanced technologies should foster and improve human relationships with the non-human world. And it's precisely these sorts of technologies that might open a truly different future in space, rather than the same old extraction and land grabbing extended out to the whole cosmos. Hornum again. Instead of imagining a future in bleak cities made from steel and glass, teeming with alienated white masses shuffling under an inescapable electronic glow, indigenous futurists think of earthen spacecrafts helmed by black and brown women with advanced knowledge of land, plants, and language. What if our approach to space were guided not by conquest and war-making and ownership and profit, but by kinship, caretaking, knowledge, and listening? Take a moment here. Imagine a space movie that's about caring for alien beings rather than killing them. Imagine a space mission that seeks learning rather than conquest. Imagine a space industry that puts the life of the biosphere and the oppressed of the earth over the making of profits. Imagine a space science that is granted the freedom to understand and relate to the land without owning it. There are actually a number of those stories out there. If you can't think of any, that's okay. It's not so much of a lack of imagination as a failure of circulation that's preventing us from changing our priorities in space. If we only open our eyes, we will see there are countless teachers, from Robin Wall Kimmerer to Ursula Le Guin, to N.K. Jemisin and Janelle Monáe, to Sun Ra, to Greta Thunberg, to the leaders of the 3 largest Christian denominations, crying out that we have got to stop trying to own the whole universe. As we know, the space industry constantly drowns out these teachers by intoning the frankly religious conviction that we can only survive if we colonize space, we can only colonize space if we privatize space, and we can only privatize space if we mine and monetize it. Our most circulated sci-fi stories reaffirm these priorities, as when Interstellar's Matthew McConaughey declares, "We're explorers, pioneers, not caretakers," or when Michael Caine quips, "We're not meant to save the Earth, we're meant to leave it." Do you see that funny language of being meant to do something? As I've tried to show, this idea that we're destined to conquer and own outer space is neither objective nor true. Rather, it's the long legacy of Western theologies that are so outdated, even the Pope says they're heretical. So why do we keep saying that conquest, extraction, ownership, and exploitation are our only imaginable future? In short, if it is stories that have gotten us here, then other stories can get us somewhere else. So let's tell some better stories. Thanks.
Hi, I'm David. I'm a freshman. One question I had was related to Manifest Destiny. The American continent was is physically limited, and the colonizers kept pushing people away. But do you think that in terms of colonizing space, the infinite nature of space, changed its dynamic?
It's a really good question. I think it means it's endless. It means it's and in that sense, there's something. If I were a theologian, which I'm not, if I were a theologian, I would say there's something heretical even about claiming infinite terrain, which should be limited to the infinity of God, God's self. Like there's something a bit out of place, right? Like God gives humans the land of Canaan, it is said in the mythic tradition, right? And then folks afterwards keep kind of pushing that more and more and more to extend to bigger and bigger land bodies. But you're right, there is a difference between claiming an enormous but still finite continent and infinity, which is like a qualitatively different kind of land claim. But this is what I'm seeing, at least rhetorically, in what people like Mike Pence are saying. Like everything that's, and Musk in a different kind of register, like everything that's out there is ours. We are meant to go there. We're destined. It's like we've been given that kind of thing. Yeah, thanks, David. I really appreciate that.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Sophia, and
Hi,
I was
Sophia.
curious as we're approaching the one-year anniversary of the first African nations, Rwanda and Kenya, signing on to the Artemis Accords, and also the push for India to join these accords. How is sort of modern-day colonialism, all of that in Africa and Southeast Asia also fueling into this conversation about what we're doing in space, what we're doing with asteroid mining on the moon and looking forward to Mars from your perspective?
Thank you so much. So, the Rwandan Space Agency just bought enough space in low Earth orbit for something like 230,000 satellites, right? They were like, yeah, that's gonna be ours. Just in case it wasn't clear, like that many satellites in low Earth orbit is a bad idea, right? Every 2 weeks, Elon Musk sends up 60 new satellites through Starlink, and you can see them all go up like a sort of string of pearls. And now there are 60 more of them, and they're all traveling at something like 28,000 miles an hour, crashing into all other sorts of things, and when something crashes into a thing, it makes more stuff, like it's a complete, anyway. But Rwanda's like, all right, well, if this is the game we're playing, let's get in there, right? The African Space Agency is trying very hard to kind of consolidate its priorities so that they can sort of speak as a continent and have a little more robustness. Obviously, India is trying to say, like, take us seriously. I think the best explanation I've received comes from a colleague and friend of mine. Her name is Timmy Biaganaba, and she's a space lawyer from Canada and England and Nigeria and a bunch of other places. And when I say to her, like, what are these previously colonized nations doing? Like, why are they joining in this clearly colonial game? She's like, yeah, okay, fine. But the reason is that what they're seeing is they're getting left behind again. And they're like, not this time, dude, not this time. Like, you did this to the Earth, you did this on our backs, you did this at our expense. If you're gonna do it again, you're bringing us up there with you, and we will do it too, because like, you can't leave us behind again, right? So I think that seems to be the kind of ethos of it. Like, if this is the way it's going, fine. We'd rather, we tried on Earth to contest the legitimacy of this way of approaching land. Didn't work. If you're doing it again, we're gonna have to just get into it this time so that we're not like lagging behind. That seems to be the idea. Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Elliot. I'm a junior.
Hey, Elliot.
And my question for you is, how do you remain optimistic in the face of the most powerful governments and some of the most powerful men on the planet that space will be explored ethically?
That is really hard. Do you have any advice? No, I mean it. Do you have any advice? Because the thing is that I am so, I don't know that I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful, because again, it's not, okay, so I have in this class that I was teaching that I've taught a couple of times on colonizing space. Do you mind if I answer this in a really long, weird, roundabout way?
Sure.
Okay. So Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos both want us to be living off the Earth. Elon Musk wants us to go to Mars. For reasons that I can explain. Jeff Bezos is like, Mars sucks. Mars is a terrible planet. It's freezing, it will kill you, it will blow up your face, like it's really bad. And it's super far away, so if anything goes wrong, it takes like 6 or 8 months to get home and you're dead by the, like there's no, much better thing to do is to create rotating space pods between the moon and Earth, Like basically big, huge shopping malls, sort of circular structures that rotate to simulate gravity. And we'll just live there, and we can like have climate control. It'll be 72 degrees all the time. You can have waterfalls. You can have whatever. You can have. And my students were like, that's disgusting. I hate Jeff Bezos. He's the worst. He's good, but I need my stuff from Amazon so badly. I'm like, I know, I understand. I feel the same way. But they don't like him for what it's worth. And somehow the conversation went to such a place where I said, okay, but here's the thing. Bezos is saying that we have a limited energy supply on Earth. We're clearly ravaging the Earth. He says that he's trying to sort of relieve some of that strain by creating these space pods. So suppose you had two options, and we had read a science fiction story like this, so we just sort of brought it to, suppose you had two options. Suppose your options were live on Earth with no energy, nothing to plug in, nothing to just you live on Earth or take all your stuff and move out to a space pod with Jeff Bezos. What would you do? And my students, I don't know about your all my students are like hippy dippy, love the land, work the farm, be so green, reusable cups, blah, 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 how dare you use styrofoam. 18 of 19 of them said they would go with Bezos. Yeah. And I was like, but they didn't feel good about it. They were like, I am so sorry, but I'm gonna go with Jeff. And I was like, that's really fascinating, why? And what they said was, it just seems impossible. It seems impossible to live on Earth without electricity and heating, and it's just absolutely impossible. And I was like, respectfully, lovingly, it seems more possible to live on a rotating space pod, with no air, where there's no air? How did we get here to a place where it feels more possible to live with the stuff we have without Earth, which is everything we are and everything that made us and everything we have and everything so what makes me optimistic what makes me sort of awe-filled and hopeful here is that there actually are a ton of people out there who know how to live differently and who know how to live respectfully. The thing that makes me unoptimistic is the possibility of actually getting through to the people who make the decisions, right? Even if you can get through to the national governments and say, regulate more, please. The big private actors in space are sorry, those regulations don't apply to me. I'm not beholden to them, and I can do this, so I will do this. Honestly, since 2020, here's the little bit of optimism. Since 2020, I really do think there are more people at NASA, there are more people in the sort of space industry. Oh, I'll tell you what makes me optimistic. So I published this weirdo book that talks about the private space industry and stuff. And I've had a lot of people talking to me about it, which has been really lovely. And one day I get this phone call out of the blue from this guy who's like, hey, I'm Trevor. Really hesitate to say this, but I'm a NewSpace CEO. I'm in charge of this NewSpace company. I just read your book, and I'm feeling really bad about myself, and I'm wondering if there's any ethical way to do what I'm trying to do. Can we have a conversation? And I was like, absolutely. And we had a great conversation, and he recommended the book to everybody on his board, and blah, blah, blah. I do think that there are more and more people in this, not because of me, because of all these other things, in the space industry and in NASA who are willing at least to ask the question about ethical practices, to interrogate whether their practices are ethical, and then maybe decide to do them a little differently. So the hope I get is from just the increasing number of people who are like, I don't know, I don't feel great about doing it this way. But yeah, if you have any better ideas, please let me know, Elliot.
I don't have any at this time.
Yeah.
The thing I will say, I think there's a lot of parallels between this and artificial intelligence. And that's maybe a little further along in that process. But obviously with artificial intelligence, there's government regulation. And as you said in the presentation, if Musk isn't beholden to one country, then what are you really supposed to do?
What are you supposed to do? Right. And and if the country to which he's beholden is please don't abandon us, because if you don't take us up to the ISS, then we got to ask Russia, and we don't want to do that. So we don't like you, but we need you. It can't just be one dude. Right? If that dude starts behaving badly, there's got to be other dudes who can help you, do the work. Yeah, thank you so much, Elliot. I appreciate it.
All right, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. And so we're talking about outer space, and I want to bring us back to the Bible.
Great. Oh yeah.
Because I'm a Hebrew Bible professor, and
I'm sorry for whatever I did.
No. But I have students in here who are in my class. I have students in here who are in a class that I teach on called Gender sexuality or gender sex in the Hebrew Bible, and so I'm like very struck by how masculine this whole thing is. And I was really struck by your last line, like we need to tell new stories. And as someone who stakes her life and her livelihood on these very, very old texts and on the ability to make them relevant in like a life-affirming justice sort of way, I want to know, like, do we really need new stories?
Right.
Or can we like reaffirm these stories? And simultaneously, I will also just say that I'm like, there's this crazy tension between like you say the Bible, and 99 or not 99, a huge percent of Americans will kind of roll their eyes like, oh, those are very irrelevant. And simultaneously, they're hugely relevant.
Yeah.
So I'll just throw that to you and see what you want to say.
Thank you. Yeah, when I say we need new stories, I don't mean, thank you for that, I'm saying it glibly. We don't need to throw out the Bible and throw out Jules Verne and throw out, but realize that our relationship to these texts, let's stick with the Bible, has always been mediated by interpretation. And there are other stories we can tell about the stories that the Bible has given us, right? And there are other ways to interpret it. So, for example, a lot of eco-theologians will say, like, we have to get rid of that dominion line, that line about how God gave them dominion over the earth. It's absolutely awful. Like, I don't know what to do. We can't even retranslate it so that it's stewardship or kinship. Like, we just have to get rid of it. And Pope Francis is like, no, what dominion actually means is something totally different than what becomes imperial earthly dominion. We actually do need this story, but we need to understand it better. This is just Pope Francis. I'm not necessarily right. So I think that it's important to, so first of all, clearly the European descended West has been dominated by the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and particularly imperial interpretations of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. So I think it would help to like pause for a second and listen literally to other stories, other kinds of stories, other creation stories. There are creation stories that really emerged from like the Cheyenne and the Cherokee folks as their land was being taken, that are like deliberate rewritings of Genesis that talk about like collaborative creators who like work with the earth creatures in order to bring something together. So I think it's important to read other stories to see that there are actually other ways to talk about creation. There are other ways to talk about divinity. There are other ways to talk about the importance of land. And then, if those are your stories, if Hebrew Bible and the New Testament are your stories, then with all of that other stuff, go back and figure out how else we can read those stories, and which parts of it we want to lift up and which parts of it we don't, and realize that these are selective readings, as biblical interpretation has always been, right? It's always been a matter of selective reading. It's just that we're doing like deliberately selective ones at this point. But yeah, no, there are parts of the Hebrew Bible in particular that are so beautiful and glorious and justice-oriented that they would take these structures down single-handedly if we would give them the chance to. But you have to like get back to it around all this stuff, and I think that it really helps to try to learn from other communities before you go back to your own texts.
You ended the lecture by talking about stories, whether it's new stories or new interpretations of old stories. You are an award-winning teacher, so what advice do you have for us? How can we nurture our imaginations better?
For teachers, how can all of us nurture our imaginations better?
Can imagination be taught? How can we nurture our imagination?
Okay, two things. One, we should all be reading more fiction. All of us. And it feels like it's like ancillary to the stuff, unless we're literature scholars, right? Like, oh God, I don't have time, I don't know. I think first of all, we should all be reading more fiction, and we should be reading probably more speculative fiction, which sort of just begins without the possible. It's like, I don't care what's possible. We are in a world made out of marmalade. We are in a world made out, whatever. Like, it just sort of starts from totally different things. And particularly, I think, speculative fiction that are written by folks on this planet who have been historically marginalized and oppressed. So indigenous futurism, I think, and Afrofuturism, Asian American authors, queer authors, folks of different kinds of genders, poor folks, right? They can often like see the world. This is who's our liberationist? There's a liberationist somewhere in the room. There's a liberation theologian somewhere in here. But anyway, like the whole insight of liberation theology is that folks who have been on the so-called underside of history can see the whole better than folks who are on the dominant side of history. So I say speculative fiction from marginalized perspectives is really wonderful because it like breaks open and you're like, I never thought. There's a story by N.K. Jemisin where she builds a city based on the premise that people should be caring for one another. So she starts from there. She's like, what would it look like to build a city of people who care for one another? And it feels like so absurd, a city of people who care for one another, but it's so basic, but it's so absurd. And N.K. Jemisin can do that. So this is one thing. And another thing that I think really helps, this is going to sound absurd, is to spend time with kids, like little kids. And to try to see from their perspective and to learn from them, to learn about what they think is possible and what sorts of things that they imagine the world is going to do and how it's going to open out for them. But also you can realize in relation to little kids what your own like real values are, like what your actual values are. Right? You have these values that you talk about with your grown-up friends and with your whatever. And then you talk to little kids and you realize like, oh, I didn't know I had that value. I once had I was taking a pandemic walk with my 3-year-old, and he like picked up a stick because he picks up sticks. He's like, "Mommy, this is my stick. This is my big stick. This is my biggest stick. I got a big stick. I'm walking with my big stick." And he takes this big stick and he whacked a tree. And I lost my mind. I was like, "You may not whack that tree." And I had no idea. Like it came from a place of just total, like pure ethical concern. Is it a correct ethical opinion? I have no idea. But it taught me that I feel really strongly about this, right? And I think that kids do that for us. They ask questions in a way that like force you to say it in a way that they can understand. You don't get to dance around it. You don't get to use German. You don't get to whatever. You just have to. Anyway, these are the two things that I find a bit helpful. Thank you.